You are Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, and it's the morning of August 11, 1785. The silk of your chemise clings to your skin, damp with the sweat of a nightmare you can't quite remember. Through the tall windows of your private chambers at Versailles, dawn light catches the gold leaf on every surface, turning your world into a glittering cage. Your ladies-in-waiting flutter around you like anxious birds, their faces carefully blank, but you can smell their fear beneath the rosewater and powder. Something is wrong. Terribly wrong. The doors to your chamber burst open without warning. Your husband, King Louis XVI, enters with a face like thunder, clutching papers in his trembling hands. Behind him stands the jeweler, Charles Boomer, his usually obsequious manner replaced by something that looks dangerously like accusation. And there, between them, sits a velvet box you've never seen before in your life. "My dear," Louis says, his voice cracking with barely contained rage, "would you care to explain why you purchased a necklace worth 2,000,000 livres without my knowledge, and why you failed to make the payments?" The blood drains from your face as Boomer opens the box to reveal nothing. The necklace is gone. A necklace you've never seen, never wanted, never ordered. But as you stare at that empty, velvet-lined case, you're looking at something far more terrifying than missing diamonds. You're looking at the weapon that will destroy you, diamond by diamond, lie by lie, until your severed head rolls into a basket 8 years from now while the mob screams for your blood. This is the story of how a prostitute, a desperate cardinal, and a con woman with delusions of nobility used 647 diamonds to light the fuse that would explode the French monarchy. This is the story of the diamond necklace affair, where truth became meaningless, reputation became everything, and a queen's innocence became the most dangerous thing she could possess. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand how a mere necklace could topple a queen, you must first understand the woman at the center of this web of lies, Jeanne de Valois Saint-Remy. Born in 1756 to a family that had fallen so far from grace they might as well have been peasants, Jeanne grew up with the bitter taste of lost nobility in her mouth. Her father, Jacques de Saint-Remy, claimed descent from King Henri II through an illegitimate line, a claim that was technically true but practically worthless in the rigid hierarchy of 18th century France. Picture little Jeanne at 7 years old, barefoot and begging on the roads of Champagne, her stomach cramped with hunger while she clutched papers proving her royal blood. Those papers might as well have been kindling for all the good they did her. She watched her mother die of starvation, watched her siblings scatter like seeds in the wind, all while knowing that somewhere in Versailles, her distant cousins lived in unimaginable luxury. The winter of 1763 was particularly cruel. Jeanne and her younger sister huddled in a barn outside Bar-sur-Aube, their feet blackened with frostbite, surviving on scraps thrown to pigs. A local noblewoman, the Marquise de Boulainvilliers, discovered them there, two small girls with ice in their hair, clutching documents that proved their descent from royalty. The contrast between their claims and their condition moved the Marquise to take them in. But charity has its limits. Jeanne learned early that even kindness came with a price. gratitude, servitude, and the constant reminder that she was living on someone else's mercy. This childhood of deprivation and humiliation forged Jeanne into something harder than the diamonds she would one day steal. She learned that in a world where bloodlines determined everything, those who had fallen from grace had two choices: accept their fate or claw their way back up by any means necessary. Jeanne chose to claw. The Marquise de Boulainvilliers provided Jeanne with an education, but it was a double-edged gift. Every lesson in etiquette, every dance step mastered, every properly conjugated Latin verb reminded Jeanne of what she should have been born to, what had been stolen from her by the accident of her father's illegitimate line. She excelled at her studies not out of gratitude but out of rage, each accomplishment a weapon she was forging for future use. By the time she was 20, Jeanne had transformed herself through sheer force of will and strategic marriage. She wed Nicolas de la Motte, an impoverished officer of the gendarmerie whose own pretensions to nobility matched her own. Together, they were a perfect pair of frauds, each supporting the other's delusions of grandeur. She began calling herself the Comtesse de la Motte, a title built on shadows and whispers, but she wore it like armor. Their early married life was a constant performance of nobility without means. They rented rooms in Versailles they couldn't afford, wore clothes that were always slightly out of fashion but impeccably maintained, and haunted the antechambers of power like ghosts of a more glorious past. Jeanne studied the mannerisms of real nobility, like a scholar studying ancient texts, noting how they walked, how they held their fans, the casual cruelty with which they dismissed servants. But Jeanne understood something that would prove crucial to her scheme. In the hall of mirrors that was Versailles, appearance was reality. If you could perform nobility convincingly enough, if you could speak the language of privilege fluently enough, then truth became negotiable. And Jeanne had become fluent in deception. She began by establishing herself in the margins of court life. She would arrive at public ceremonies in hired carriages, dismissing them just out of sight, so it appeared she had her own. She cultivated relationships with minor officials and impoverished nobles who were themselves clinging to the edges of respectability. Slowly, carefully, she built a reputation as a woman of quality who had suffered reversals but maintained her dignity. Enter Cardinal Louis-René Edouard de Rohan, Prince de Rohan-Guémené, Bishop of Strasbourg, and one of the most powerful men in France, except in the one place that mattered most. The cardinal was a study in contradictions, a prince of the church who lived like a secular prince, a man of enormous wealth who was perpetually in debt, a sophisticated courtier who could be as naive as a child when his vanity was properly stroked. The cardinal's fall from grace had begun in Vienna, where he had served as French ambassador from 1772 to 1774. He had been sent to improve relations with Austria, France's new ally through the marriage of the Dauphin to Marie Antoinette. Instead, he had created a diplomatic disaster through a combination of extravagance, indiscretion, and shocking rudeness to Empress Maria Theresa. The Empress, Marie Antoinette's mother, was a formidable woman who had held the Habsburg Empire together through sheer force of will. She expected to be treated with the deference due to her position. Instead, Rohan had treated the Austrian court as an extension of Versailles, carrying on affairs with married women, spreading gossip, and, most unforgivably, writing dispatches back to France that mocked the Empress's age, appearance, and strict morality. In one particularly damning letter that was intercepted and shown to Maria Theresa, Rohan had written, "The Empress still fancies herself a beauty at her age, surrounding herself with mirrors and young courtiers who pretend not to notice her wrinkles. She rules her empire like a convent, imposing her prudish morality on a court that longs for French sophistication. The Empress never forgave these insults, and she made sure her daughter never forgot them either. When Marie Antoinette became Queen of France in 1774, she brought with her the long memory of Austrian pride. The cardinal found himself frozen out of court, his requests for audiences denied, his presence at royal functions barely tolerated. For a man who had built his entire identity on proximity to power, this exile was a living death. He would spend hours at his estate in Saverne, staring at portraits of the Queen, wondering how he could possibly breach the wall of ice she had built around herself. The cardinal's desperation was compounded by his financial situation. Despite enormous revenues from his various ecclesiastical positions, he lived perpetually beyond his means. He maintained multiple residences, each decorated with priceless art. He kept a small army of servants, musicians, and artists. He threw lavish parties that he couldn't afford, trying to maintain his relevance through spectacle. By 1784, his debts had reached catastrophic proportions, and his creditors were growing impatient. It was in this state of financial and social desperation that the cardinal first encountered Jeanne de la Motte at a public function in Versailles. She had been watching him for weeks, studying his habits, his weaknesses, his overwhelming need to regain royal favor. When she finally approached him, she did so with the perfect combination of deference and intimacy that suggested she knew secrets others didn't. Their initial conversations were carefully orchestrated performances on Jeanne's part. She would mention the Queen casually, dropping hints about private conversations and secret sympathies. When the cardinal pressed for details, she would demur, suggesting that some things were too delicate to discuss openly. She made him work for every revelation, understanding that information given too freely would be suspected, while information extracted with effort would be believed. The cardinal was 50 years old when Jeanne de la Motte entered his life, but in matters of court intrigue, he was as naive as a child. He wanted so desperately to believe that redemption was possible, that the Queen's favor could be won back, that he became the perfect mark for a woman who had spent her entire life learning to exploit desperate hope. Jeanne began their relationship as she began all her conquests, by making herself indispensable. She became the cardinal's mistress, but more importantly, she became his confidant, the one person who seemed to understand his pain. She would listen for hours as he spoke of his fall from grace, nodding sympathetically while her mind spun webs of possibility. "What if," she said one evening in the spring of 1784, as they lay in his bed at the Palais Cardinal, the enormous residence that was bleeding him dry, "I told you I had a way to reach the Queen." The cardinal's reaction was almost pitiful in its eagerness. He sat up so quickly he nearly fell from the bed, his eyes bright with a hope that had been dormant for years. Jeanne played him like a master musician, revealing her friendship with Marie Antoinette slowly, carefully, making him work for every morsel of information. She told him how she had met the Queen during one of her charitable visits to the poor, a complete fabrication. Marie Antoinette's charitable visits were always highly publicized and carefully controlled. How the Queen had been moved by her story of noble blood fallen on hard times. The Queen had never heard of her. How they had developed a secret correspondence. Every letter would be forged by Jeanne's accomplice, Rétaux de Villette. The story Jeanne constructed was masterful in its plausibility. She claimed that the Queen, isolated by court protocol and her husband's awkwardness, longed for genuine friendship. That she, Jeanne, provided a connection to a simpler, more authentic world outside the suffocating etiquette of Versailles. That their correspondence had to remain secret because the king would disapprove of his wife maintaining friendships outside approved court circles. The cardinal believed it all because he needed to believe it. Here was his path back to grace, delivered by a woman who asked for nothing in return except the chance to help him. He never stopped to wonder why the queen would choose such an unlikely intermediary. Never questioned why their correspondence had to remain so secret. His desire for redemption made him blind. The forged letters began in early 1784. Rétaux de Villette, a former soldier with a talent for mimicry, studied examples of Marie Antoinette's handwriting until he could reproduce it perfectly. But more than mere penmanship, he had to capture the voice of a queen. Imperious, yet vulnerable, formal, yet occasionally intimate. The content of these letters was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. The first letter, delivered by Jeanne with trembling hands and warnings about absolute discretion, was cool and distant. Madame de la Motte has spoken to me of your desire for reconciliation. I confess myself surprised, given the circumstances of our past interactions. However, Christian charity demands that I at least consider your request for forgiveness. It was signed simply Marie Antoinette, a detail that would later prove crucial. Each subsequent letter was calculated to keep the cardinal perpetually off balance, moving between hope and despair. Sometimes the queen would express interest in reconciliation. Your evident contrition has touched my heart. Perhaps the time has come to forget past unpleasantness. Other times she would pull back. Recent events at court have reminded me why discretion in our correspondence must be absolute. There are those who would use any sign of softness on my part against me. The cardinal treasured these letters like holy relics. He had a special cabinet made to store them, with a lock to which only he had the key. He would read them over and over, analyzing every word for hidden meaning, pressing them to his lips like a lovesick teenager. Each letter deepened his dependence on Jeanne as the sole conduit to redemption. He began sending gifts through Jeanne, small at first, then increasingly lavish. Money for the Queen's private charities, which went directly into Jeanne's purse. Jewels for her secret projects, which Jeanne sold or kept for herself. Books and artworks that the Queen had supposedly admired, which decorated Jeanne's apartments. The cardinal never questioned why he never received direct acknowledgement of these gifts, accepting Jeanne's explanations that the Queen had to maintain absolute discretion. By the summer of 1784, the cardinal had given Jeanne over 120,000 livres in money and gifts. But, more than the financial drain, he had given her complete power over his emotional life. His moods rose and fell with the arrival of each letter. A warm note from the Queen would send him into ecstasies of joy. A cool one would plunge him into despair. Jeanne had become the architect of his reality. But Jeanne knew that letters alone wouldn't sustain the illusion forever. The cardinal was growing impatient, pushing for a face-to-face meeting with the Queen. His letters to Marie Antoinette became increasingly urgent. Your Majesty's written words are treasures I hold dear, but I long to hear your voice speak the forgiveness your letters promise. Grant me but 5 minutes in your presence, and I shall die content. So Jeanne orchestrated one of the most audacious deceptions in the history of confidence tricks. she would give him his meeting. The woman she chose for this performance was Nicole Legay d'Oliva, a prostitute from the Palais Royal who bore a passing resemblance to Marie Antoinette, at least in dim light, at a distance, to a man whose desire to see the queen would override his better judgment. Nicole was young, blonde, and possessed of a certain regal bearing that could, with the right staging, approximate royalty. Jeanne discovered Nicole in one of the Palais Royal's many establishments of dubious reputation and was struck by the girl's profile, so similar to the queen's that it seemed like providence. Nicole was 23 but could pass for younger, had the queen's fair complexion and blue eyes, and, most importantly, was desperate enough to agree to almost anything for the right price. The preparation for the meeting was meticulous. Jeanne coached Nicole for days, teaching her to speak in short, ambiguous phrases that could mean anything the listener wanted them to mean. She trained her in the queen's manner of walking, gliding rather than stepping, head held high, movements deliberate and graceful. She dressed her in a white muslin gown similar to those the queen favored for her private moments, draped a light veil over her face, and prayed that love, or at least desperate hope, would be blind. The meeting was set for August 11th, 1784, in the Grove of Venus at Versailles. The location was carefully chosen, secluded enough to avoid accidental discovery, but within the palace grounds to add authenticity. The grove, with its classical statuary and carefully manicured hedges, would provide the perfect theatrical backdrop for this performance. On the appointed night, the cardinal made his way through the darkened gardens, his heart pounding with anticipation. He had dressed in his finest clothes, a silk suit that had cost more than most people earned in a year, his insignia of noble orders glittering in the moonlight. He had rehearsed 1,000 speeches of apology and devotion, had imagined this moment so many times that reality could hardly compete with his fantasies. When he saw the white figure waiting in the grove, when he heard her whisper, "You know what this means," and press a rose into his hand, he fell to his knees with tears streaming down his face. In that moment, all his sophistication, all his worldly experience, all his intelligence deserted him. He was a man transfigured by the fulfillment of desperate hope. The meeting lasted less than 5 minutes. Jeanne, playing the role of the queen's attendant, quickly ushered the false Marie Antoinette away, claiming that someone was approaching. But those 5 minutes were enough. The cardinal left the garden convinced he had been forgiven, that the queen's whispered words and the rose she had given him were promises of restored favor. He never suspected that Nicole Legay had been paid 15,000 livres for her performance and disappeared back into the Parisian underworld the next morning. He never questioned why the queen would meet him in such strange circumstances, why she would speak so little, why she would vanish so quickly. His desire to believe transformed a prostitute in a costume into the Queen of France. The psychological impact of this meeting on the cardinal cannot be overstated. He had touched the queen's hand, or so he believed, had heard her voice speak forgiveness, had been given a tangible token of her favor. The rose was pressed and preserved, placed in a golden reliquary like a saint's relic. He would take it out and gaze at it during moments of doubt, physical proof that his redemption was real. With the cardinal now completely under her control, Jeanne was ready for her masterstroke. She had heard of a necklace, a legendary piece of jewelry that had been haunting the royal jewelers Baumer and Bassange for over a decade. It was a monstrosity of luxury. 647 diamonds totaling 2,800 carats, arranged in elaborate festoons and tassels, with a weight so substantial that wearing it would have been physically uncomfortable. The necklace had been commissioned in 1772 by Louis XV for his mistress, Madame du Barry. The king, in his 60s and still pursuing pleasures of the flesh with the enthusiasm of a much younger man, had wanted to give his favorite the most spectacular jewel in Europe. The jewelers had spent 2 years acquiring the finest diamonds, designing settings that would showcase each stone to perfection, creating a piece that would outshine anything worn by queens or empresses. But Louis XV died of smallpox in 1774, before the purchase could be completed. Madame du Barry, stripped of her position and exiled from court, certainly couldn't afford it. The jewelers were left with a ruinously expensive albatross around their necks. They had borrowed heavily to create the necklace, mortgaging their business, their homes, their futures on the assumption that royal patronage was guaranteed. They had offered it repeatedly to Louis XVI for his queen, but Marie Antoinette, in one of history's great ironies, had refused it. When first shown the necklace in 1775, she had allegedly said, "We have more need of a ship than of diamonds," showing a fiscal restraint that would later be forgotten when she stood accused of bankrupting France. The truth was more complex. She found the necklace ugly, too ostentatious even for a queen, and tainted by its association with her predecessor's mistress. The jewelers grew increasingly desperate as the years passed. They tried everything, reducing the price, offering extended payment terms, even suggesting the necklace could be broken up into smaller pieces. But no one wanted to buy a necklace with such a problematic provenance, and breaking it up would mean admitting defeat and accepting enormous losses. By 1784, they were facing complete ruin, unless they could find a buyer for their diamond monstrosity. It was at this moment of mutual desperation that Jeanne de la Motte's path crossed with theirs. She had seen the necklace during one of the jeweler's desperate attempts to display it at court, and while others saw an overpriced anachronism, she saw opportunity. Here was an object worth a fortune, desired by no one, connected to the royal family and perfect for her purposes. The plan she conceived was breathtaking in its audacity. She would convince the cardinal that Marie Antoinette wanted the necklace but needed to purchase it secretly, without her husband's knowledge. The cardinal, eager to prove his devotion and with access to vast wealth, would acquire it on the queen's behalf. The necklace would then disappear into Jeanne's hands, to be broken up and sold piece by piece. In December 1784, Jeanne began laying the groundwork. The forged letters from Marie Antoinette began mentioning the necklace obliquely at first. I recently saw again that remarkable creation of Baumer and Bassange. What a pity that circumstances prevent its acquisition. Then, more directly, the king's economies, while admirable, sometimes prevent a queen from appearing as befits her station. If only there were a way to acquire certain items without troubling the royal treasury. The cardinal, reading these hints with the eagerness of a man looking for any way to serve, immediately offered his assistance. His letters back were full of florid promises to help the queen acquire anything her heart desired, to use his wealth in service of her glory. Jeanne, through her forged responses, played coy at first, then gradually more accepting of his offers. By January 1785, the stage was set. Jeanne arranged a meeting between the cardinal and the jewelers at her house in Versailles. She had prepared forged documents that she claimed the queen had sent. Contracts, letters of intent, all bearing the signature Marie Antoinette de France. This signature would prove crucial, as the real queen never used this formulation, signing official documents simply Marie Antoinette. But Beaumer and Bassange were too relieved at the prospect of finally selling their necklace to scrutinize the documents carefully. Here was Cardinal de Rohan, one of the richest men in France, guaranteeing the purchase. Here were documents that appeared to bear the Queen's signature. Their desperation to believe made them as blind as the cardinal to obvious irregularities. The terms were agreed upon. 2 million livres to be paid in installments over 2 years, with the first payment of 400,000 livres due in 6 months. The cardinal, acting as guarantor for the Queen, signed the contracts with a flourish. He was so happy to be of service, so convinced that this would cement his restoration to favor, that he never stopped to wonder why the Queen couldn't simply purchase the necklace openly. On February 1st, 1785, the jewelers delivered the necklace to the cardinal's palace. The ceremony of transfer was conducted with great solemnity. The jewelers had created a special case of red Morocco leather, lined with white velvet, to house their creation. As they opened it, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows caught the diamonds, sending rainbows dancing across the walls. Jeanne was waiting with a man she introduced as the Queen's valet. This was actually her husband, Nicolas de la Motte, dressed in royal livery that Jeanne had either stolen or had made by a theatrical costumer. Nicolas played his part perfectly, maintaining the grave dignity of a royal servant entrusted with a crucial mission. The cardinal watched as the valet departed with the necklace, believing it was on its way to the Queen. In reality, it was on its way to Jeanne's house, where she and her husband would spend the next weeks carefully dismantling the piece that had taken years to create. They worked at night, by candlelight, using jewelers' tools to pry each diamond from its setting. Think about the symbolism of this moment. A necklace designed to adorn the neck of a king's mistress, refused by a queen who would later be accused of every excess, was being torn apart by a woman who had been denied her birthright. Each diamond pried from its setting was a small revenge against the system that had left Jeanne begging on the roads as a child. Nicolas de la Motte proved particularly useful in disposing of the diamonds. As a military officer, he had freedom of movement that Jeanne lacked. He made several trips to London, where diamonds could be sold with fewer questions asked. He used different jewelers, never selling too many stones to one buyer, always claiming they were family heirlooms being sold to pay debts. Some of the finest stones went to Amsterdam, then as now a center of the diamond trade. Others were sold in Paris to jewelers who asked few questions about provenance. The elaborate gold settings, masterworks of the jeweler's art, were melted down for their metal value. Within weeks, one of the most spectacular pieces of jewelry ever created had been reduced to commodity metals and stones scattered across Europe. For several months, the scheme worked perfectly. The cardinal, floating on the cloud of his imagined reconciliation with the Queen, didn't press for acknowledgement of the gift. Jeanne continued to provide forged letters expressing the Queen's gratitude. The necklace is even more beautiful than I remembered. I wear it only in private for now, but soon I shall display it at court, and all will know to whom I owe this magnificence. These letters kept the cardinal in a state of happy anticipation. He imagined the sensation when the Queen appeared at a state function wearing the necklace, the court's amazement when she publicly acknowledged his role in acquiring it. He had visions of being invited to sit near her at dinners, of private audiences where she would thank him in person, of a complete restoration to favor that would silence his critics and confound his enemies. But by July 1785, reality began to intrude. The first payment was due, and the cardinal found himself in an awkward position. He had expected the Queen to have made arrangements for payment by now, had assumed that his role was simply to facilitate the purchase, not to actually fund it. When he delicately inquired through Jean about the payment arrangements, he received a forged letter that shattered his composure. "My dear Cardinal, circumstances at court make it impossible for me to access the funds at this moment. I must rely upon your generosity a while longer. Surely the man who has shown such devotion will not fail me now when I need him most. The first payment must come from you, but rest assured you will be repaid with interest, both financial and personal." The cardinal, though wealthy, didn't have 400,000 livres readily available. His estates generated enormous income, but his expenses were even more enormous. He lived like a prince of the Renaissance, maintaining multiple palaces, supporting artists and musicians, throwing lavish entertainments. To raise the money, he would have to sell property or borrow against future income. He negotiated with the jewelers for a reduction and an extension. Böhmer and Bassange, now growing nervous about the delayed payment, agreed to accept 300,000 livres and to extend the deadline by 3 months. They were still confident in the cardinal's guarantee, but doubt was beginning to creep in. Why was the Queen not handling this directly? Why all the secrecy? It was Böhmer who inadvertently lit the fuse that would explode the entire scheme. On July 12, 1785, he encountered Marie Antoinette at Versailles during a public ceremony. Unable to contain himself, he approached her with obsequious bows and began thanking her for her purchase, expressing his hope that she was enjoying the necklace and mentioning that he looked forward to the first payment. Marie Antoinette's reaction was one of complete bewilderment. She stared at the jeweler as if he had spoken in a foreign language, then said coldly, "I do not understand you, Monsieur Böhmer. I have purchased nothing from you." The jeweler, interpreting her coldness as discretion in a public setting, bowed and withdrew, but the Queen's confusion was genuine. The encounter troubled Marie Antoinette enough that she mentioned it to her first lady-in-waiting, Madame Campan. "The strangest thing happened today," she said as Campan helped her prepare for bed. "That jeweler Böhmer thanked me for purchasing his necklace, that hideous thing he's been trying to sell for years. He seemed quite convinced I had bought it." Madame Campan, who managed much of the Queen's correspondence and knew every detail of her expenditures, was alarmed. She knew for certain that no necklace had been purchased, that no payments were scheduled. Together, they began to sense that something was terribly wrong. On August 3, 1785, Böhmer sent a cryptic letter to the Queen, carefully worded but clearly referencing the arrangements made for the necklace. Marie Antoinette, now thoroughly confused and increasingly worried, showed the letter to the king during their private dinner. Louis XVI, usually slow to action and preferring to avoid conflict, recognized the seriousness of the situation immediately. "Someone," he said, his face grave, "has purchased the most expensive necklace in France in your name. We must get to the bottom of this immediately." The next morning, August 4th, Louis summoned Böhmer to his private cabinet. The king, despite his reputation for indecisiveness, could be formidable when roused. He demanded a complete explanation. When was the necklace purchased? By whom? Under what terms? Where was it now? What Böhmer revealed sent shockwaves through Versailles. The Queen had apparently purchased the necklace through Cardinal de Rohan 6 months ago. The Cardinal had signed contracts guaranteeing payment. The necklace had been delivered to a man identified as the Queen's valet. Documents bearing the Queen's signature had authorized the entire transaction. Marie Antoinette's protestations of innocence met with Boehmer's production of documents. When she saw the signature, Marie Antoinette de France, her fury was volcanic. "This is not my signature," she exclaimed. "I signed myself, Marie Antoinette, nothing more. How could you be so foolish as to accept such an obvious forgery?" But her anger at the jewelers was nothing compared to her rage at hearing Cardinal de Rohan's name. Here was the man who had insulted her mother, whom she had deliberately excluded from court life, now apparently using her name for some nefarious purpose. In her mind, there could be only one explanation. The cardinal was attempting to humiliate her through this elaborate fraud. The king and queen spent the next days in urgent consultation with their ministers. Baron de Breteuil, who harbored his own animosity toward the cardinal, urged immediate and public action. Others counseled discretion, suggesting a private investigation that would avoid scandal. But Marie Antoinette would not be swayed. She wanted vindication, and she wanted it public. On August 15, 1785, the Feast of the Assumption, one of the most important religious holidays of the year, Cardinal de Rohan was summoned to the king's cabinet. He arrived in full ceremonial vestments, having just celebrated Mass in the royal chapel. The magnificent robes, heavy with gold embroidery and precious stones, would make his coming humiliation all the more dramatic. What followed was one of the most dramatic confrontations in the history of Versailles. The cardinal entered to find not just the king and queen, but also Baron de Breteuil, the minister of the royal household and the keeper of the seals. The atmosphere was arctic. Marie Antoinette stood rigid with fury, her famous blue eyes blazing with a cold fire that made strong men quail. Louis XVI, despite his usual mildness, spoke with the authority of an absolute monarch. "Cardinal, explain to us your role in the purchase of a diamond necklace from Boehmer and Bassange." The cardinal, suddenly realizing the ground had shifted beneath his feet, stammered out his story. He spoke of Madame de la Motte, of the secret correspondence with the Queen, of his desire to serve Her Majesty, of the meeting in the Grove of Venus. With each word, he saw the trap he had fallen into, but he couldn't stop talking, couldn't stop trying to explain what now seemed inexplicable even to himself. Marie Antoinette's reaction was devastating. "How could you believe," she said, her voice dripping with contempt, "that I would choose you, of all people, as an intermediary? You, whom I have not addressed a word to in 8 years? You, who insulted my mother and brought dishonor to France in Vienna? Your stupidity is exceeded only by your presumption." The cardinal desperately produced one of the forged letters. Marie Antoinette took one look at the signature and laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed in the ornate chamber. "This is neither my writing nor my signature," she declared. "Any fool could see it is a forgery. But then, you have proven yourself to be exactly that, a fool." In that moment, the cardinal saw the truth. He had been deceived on a spectacular scale. The blood drained from his face as he realized the magnitude of his folly. He had guaranteed a debt of 2 million livres based on forged letters and a meeting with an impostor. His desire for redemption had made him the perfect fool for whoever had orchestrated this fraud. What happened next would prove to be one of the great miscalculations of Marie Antoinette's life. She insisted, demanded, that the cardinal be arrested immediately, in public, while still wearing his ceremonial robes. She wanted the world to see that she was innocent, that she was the victim of a monstrous fraud. She wanted her vindication to be as public as possible. Louis XVI, always susceptible to his wife's stronger will, agreed despite the misgivings of some ministers. Baron de Breteuil, delighted at the chance to humiliate his enemy, personally gave the order. As the cardinal was led through the Galerie des Glaces in full view of the court, as whispers rose to shocked exclamations, as the greatest scandal in the history of Versailles unfolded before hundreds of witnesses, neither Louis nor Marie Antoinette understood what they had just done. They had turned a private fraud into a public spectacle. They had given their enemies the greatest gift imaginable, a scandal that touched the Queen herself. In their desire for vindication, they had lit a fuse that would eventually explode their entire world. The cardinal's arrest sent shockwaves through every level of French society. A prince of the church, a member of one of France's most illustrious families, arrested like a common criminal while wearing his sacred vestments, it was unprecedented. The symbolism was devastating. The monarchy attacking the church, the Austrian queen persecuting a French nobleman. Within hours, all of Paris knew that something extraordinary had happened. The arrest of Jeanne de la Motte came shortly after, though not before she had managed to burn many incriminating documents. Her husband, Nicolas, had already fled to London with a fortune in diamonds, displaying the cunning that had made him such an effective accomplice. Jeanne's arrest was dramatically different from the cardinal's. There was no ceremonial vestments to provide dignity, no illustrious name to provide protection. She was seized at her residence in Bar-sur-Aube, dragged away while screaming protestations of innocence and dark hints about the Queen's involvement in matters too scandalous to speak aloud. Rétaux de Villette, the forger, was caught trying to escape to Switzerland, his bags full of money that Jean had paid him for his services. Nicole Leguay d'Oliva was found in Brussels, pregnant and terrified, having hoped her brief impersonation of a queen was forgotten. The principal players were assembled, but the damage was already spreading like wildfire through France. The very public nature of the cardinal's arrest had ensured that everyone from the highest noble to the lowest street sweeper knew that something extraordinary had happened. The details that emerged: a cardinal deceived by a con woman, a queen's signature forged, a prostitute impersonating royalty in the gardens of Versailles, were too delicious for public consumption to resist. Pamphlets appeared on the streets of Paris within days, each more sensational than the last. Some portrayed the cardinal as a fool, others as a victim. Some suggested the Queen's innocence, others hinted at deeper involvement. The truth became less important than the narrative, and the narrative was being written by enemies of the monarchy who recognized a golden opportunity. The decision to pursue a public trial was another catastrophic miscalculation. Marie Antoinette, convinced of her innocence and desperate for vindication, pushed for the most public proceedings possible. She wanted the world to see that she had been wronged, that her reputation had been unjustly maligned. She failed to understand that in the court of public opinion, the accused is often guilty regardless of the facts. You are Marcus Aurelius Maximus, though your comrades simply call you Max. It's the winter of 168 A.D., and you're huddled in a frozen tent on the banks of the Danube, the Germanic frontier a wall of black forest across the icy river. The wind howls through gaps in the leather walls, carrying the scent of wood smoke and unwashed bodies. 20 men share this space, pressed together for warmth in the bitter cold that has already claimed 3 fingers from your left hand. Beside you lies Gaius, your contubernalis, your tent mate, your shield brother, your everything. His breath warms your neck as he sleeps, one arm thrown protectively across your chest even in slumber. You've shared this rough bed for 3 years now, through campaigns in Britannia, Dacia, and now here at the edge of the world. Tomorrow you march into those dark forests where Germanic tribes wait with their axes and their fury. Tonight might be your last. You turn slightly, studying Gaius's face in the dim light of the brazier, the scar that runs from his left eyebrow to his jaw. You remember the Dacian sword that gave it to him. Remember holding his head in your lap as the medicus stitched it closed. Remember the promises you whispered to keep him conscious through the pain. His hand tightens on your chest, pulling you closer, and you realize he's awake too. "Can't sleep either?" he whispers, his voice rough with fatigue and something else. Fear, perhaps, though neither of you would ever name it aloud. "The wind," you lie. Both of you know it's not the wind keeping you awake. It's the knowledge that tomorrow's battle could separate you forever, that the bond you forged in blood and darkness might be severed by a barbarian blade. He shifts, raising himself on one elbow to look down at you. In the shadows, his eyes are pools of darkness, but you know their color as well as your own. Brown flecked with gold, like the wheat fields of Italia you both dream of seeing again. His free hand comes up to trace the edge of your jaw, a gesture so familiar it's become ritual. "If tomorrow goes badly," he begins, but you press your fingers to his lips. "Tomorrow we fight as we always do," you interrupt. Side by side, shields locked, watching each other's flanks, as we have sworn. But he shakes his head, pulling your hand away. "Max, listen to me. If I fall, you won't. If I fall," he continues firmly, "you must live. Return to Rome. Find that farm you always talk about. Find a good woman, have sons." Now it's your turn to silence him, but not with fingers. Your mouth finds his in the darkness, a kiss that tastes of desperation and promises that might not survive the dawn. Around you, other paired soldiers are having similar whispered conversations, making similar unspoken vows. This is the secret heartbeat of the Legion. Not just brothers in arms, but something deeper. Something that has no name in your language but exists in every desperate embrace, every shared glance across the battlefield, every night like this when death stands just beyond the tent walls. When you finally pull apart, Gaius rests his forehead against yours. "In this life and the next," he whispers the oath you swore to each other after your first battle together, when you pulled him from beneath a pile of enemy dead and knew you could never be separated. "In this life and the next," you repeat, sealing the vow with another kiss. Neither of you speaks of love. Roman soldiers don't speak of such things. But as you hold each other through the long cold hours before battle, as 20,000 other Roman soldiers hold their chosen brothers in 20,000 other freezing tents, you are part of something the historians will never record. The secret intimacies that forged an empire, written not in stone monuments but in the fierce loyalty between men who faced death together and found something worth living for in each other's arms. Dawn will come soon. The trumpets will sound. You will strap on your armor and take your place in the battle line, Gaius at your right side where he belongs. Some of you will die. But tonight, in this moment, you are alive and together, and that is enough. That has always been enough. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The Roman military machine that conquered most of the known world wasn't just built on discipline, training, and tactical innovation. It was held together by bonds between soldiers that went far deeper than mere camaraderie. These were intimate relationships, physical, emotional, and spiritual, that the empire deliberately cultivated even as it publicly condemned them. Understanding these hidden intimacies reveals a truth about Roman military power that traditional histories have either ignored or actively suppressed. That love between soldiers wasn't a weakness to be eliminated, but a strength to be harnessed. The Roman military system was designed to create isolation from civilian life. When a man joined the legions, he signed up for 25 years of service. 25 years. Consider that most recruits were between 17 and 20 years old. They were signing away their entire youth and much of their middle age. Marriage was forbidden to serving soldiers until the reign of Septimius Severus in 197 A.D. This wasn't just a regulation. It was a deliberate policy designed to ensure that a soldier's primary loyalty was to his unit, not to a family waiting at home. But the Roman military mind understood a fundamental truth about human nature. Men cannot live without intimate connections. Denied wives and families, soldiers would inevitably form deep bonds with each other. Rather than fighting this reality, the Roman military structure encouraged and channeled it. The contubernium system, where 8 men shared a tent, equipment, and daily life for years on end, wasn't just about efficient organization. It was about creating the conditions for profound emotional and physical bonds that would translate into unbreakable loyalty on the battlefield. These 8-man units ate together, slept together, maintained their equipment together, and faced punishment together. If one man deserted, his 7 tent mates could be decimated, literally 1 in 10 killed. This shared fate created an environment where the bonds between soldiers became matters of life and death. Is it any wonder that these bonds often became intimate in every sense of the word? The layout of a contubernium tent tells its own story. 8 men in a space roughly 10 feet by 10 feet, sharing not just the tent, but also 2 support servants, a mule, and all their equipment. On campaign, they would sleep pressed together for warmth, often sharing blankets and body heat. The forced physical intimacy of military life broke down the barriers that might exist in civilian society. Men who had never been naked in front of anyone but family members found themselves bathing together in rivers, treating each other's wounds, caring for each other through dysentery and fever. Legion bath houses were social centers where nudity was the norm and physical contact unremarkable. Soldiers would oil each other before exercise, scrape each other clean with strigils, massage sore muscles after long marches. This casual physical intimacy created an environment where the boundaries between different types of touch became fluid. The same hands that helped you into your armor might later offer different kinds of comfort in the darkness of the tent. But it went beyond mere physical proximity. The Roman military created rituals and institutions that bound soldiers together in ways that mimicked and sometimes exceeded marriage. The sacramentum, the military oath, was a sacred vow that linked soldiers not just to the emperor, but to each other. They swore to follow their standards, never desert their comrades, and die if necessary to protect the man beside them in the battle line. The selection of a tent mate was rarely random. Veterans would choose new recruits who showed promise, taking them under their protection in exchange for various services, maintaining equipment, preparing food, and, yes, providing intimate companionship. These relationships, known as soldier-boy pairings, were so common they had their own vocabulary. The older soldier was the frater, brother, while the younger was the pure, boy, though these terms carried connotations that went beyond their literal meanings. Letters that have survived from military camps along the frontiers provide glimpses into these relationships. A papyrus from Egypt preserves a letter from a soldier named Apion to his tent mate Epimachus. I pray daily to Serapis for your health. I think of you constantly. When I am on watch at night, I see your face in the stars. The other men mock me for refusing their invitations to the brothels in town. But how could I touch another when I have sworn myself to you? Another fragment from the Vindolanda tablets in Britain contains what appears to be a love poem from one soldier to another. Your eyes are my morning sun, your voice my marching drum. In battle I am fearless, for I fight not for Rome, but for the chance to share another night beside you. These weren't isolated cases. The sheer volume of similar sentiments found in military correspondence suggests that emotional and physical relationships between soldiers were not just common, but expected. The Roman military had effectively created a culture where same-sex intimacy was not just tolerated, but institutionalized, even as civilian Roman society maintained strict prohibitions against such relationships between free citizens. The genius of this system became apparent on the battlefield. The Roman military formation, the legendary manipular system, and later the cohort system, depended on soldiers maintaining formation under extreme stress. Men had to trust that the soldier beside them would hold the line, would not break and run, would die rather than expose their flank. This level of trust couldn't be created through training alone. It required deep emotional bonds. Consider the Battle of Watling Street in 61 AD, where Suetonius Paulinus's legions faced Boudicca's massive rebel army. Outnumbered perhaps 20-1, the Roman forces formed a narrow front in a defile, shields locked, waiting for the British charge. Contemporary accounts describe the steadiness of the Roman line as supernatural, men standing shoulder to shoulder as tens of thousands of screaming warriors rushed toward them. What the accounts don't mention is what archaeological evidence suggests. The pairs of soldiers found buried together, some still with arms around each other, their positions indicating they died protecting one another rather than trying to flee. These weren't just comrades. The burial goods and positioning suggest intimate partners who chose death together over survival apart. The Roman military actively reinforced these pair bonds through various mechanisms. The decoration system rewarded soldiers who showed extraordinary valor in protecting their comrades. The highest honors went not to those who killed the most enemies, but to those who saved Roman lives, particularly the life of their tent mate or battle partner. The corona civica, a crown of oak leaves, could only be won by saving a fellow citizen in battle. Training exercises were designed to strengthen these bonds. Soldiers drilled in pairs, learning to fight as a unit, to anticipate each other's movements, to cover each other's weaknesses. They competed in athletic contests as pairs, wrestled naked in the Greek fashion, and developed the kind of physical synchronicity that only comes from intimate familiarity with another's body. The Medici, military doctors, provide another window into these relationships. Medical texts from military contexts show a preoccupation with injuries and ailments that modern scholars have euphemistically termed camp diseases, but which clearly indicate sexual activity between soldiers. Rather than treating these as disciplinary matters, medical personnel provided treatment and advice, suggesting an institutional acceptance of sexual relationships within the ranks. One medical text advises treatment for anal fissures, common among the younger soldiers, recommending olive oil and rest with no moral judgment attached. Another discusses methods for dealing with jealousy-induced violence between tent mates, treating it as a medical rather than disciplinary issue. The pragmatic approach of military medical personnel suggests they saw these relationships as facts of camp life to be managed rather than scandals to be suppressed. The engineering marvels that Roman soldiers created, the roads, walls, and fortifications that still dot the landscape of Europe, were built by men working in these intimate pairs and small units. When you walk along Hadrian's Wall today, you're walking along stones placed by lovers, by men who found comfort in each other's arms after days of backbreaking labor in the British rain. Inscriptions found along the wall include dedication stones where pairs of soldiers carved their names together, sometimes with symbols that suggest more than mere friendship. One stone bears the names Marcus and Quintus, surrounded by a heart-shaped border, a symbol that meant the same thing then as it does now. Another shows two soldiers' names connected by carved, clasped hands, the Roman symbol of Concordia, but here clearly indicating a personal rather than political union. The Roman military camps themselves were designed with these relationships in mind. Unlike modern barracks with their rows of individual bunks, Roman soldiers slept 2 or 3 to a bed in their permanent camps. The layout provided no privacy from tent mates, but significant privacy from outsiders. Centurions had their own quarters, creating a command structure that allowed intimate relationships among the rank and file to flourish without official observation. Bathhouses attached to permanent camps were sites of particular intimacy. After the structured hierarchies of daily military life, the baths were spaces where rank mattered less than personal relationships. The caldarium, the hot room, with its steamy atmosphere and relaxed social rules, became a place where the physical intimacy that characterized military life could express itself more freely. Archaeological excavations of military bathhouses have uncovered graffiti that makes the nature of activities there explicit. Drawings of sexual acts between soldiers, boastful inscriptions about sexual conquests within the ranks, and what appear to be love notes scratched into the walls. One inscription from a bathhouse in Carnuntum reads, "Lucius loves Marcus with the fire of Vulcan," using divine metaphor to express human passion. But these relationships weren't always harmonious. Military discipline records show that violence between tent mates, often sparked by sexual jealousy, was a persistent problem. The punishments for such violence were typically lighter than for other infractions, suggesting that commanders understood and accepted the passionate nature of these relationships. A disciplinary record from Syria describes a case where a soldier named Titus attacked his tent mate Flavius after finding him with another man. Rather than the severe punishment that assaulting a fellow soldier would normally merit, Titus received only a reduction in rations and extra duties. The centurion's note on the case reads, "The heat of youth and the closeness of campaign life must be considered." The Roman military also had to manage the integration of new recruits into this system of intimate bonds. young men arriving at their units would find themselves courted by veterans seeking new tent mates. The process resembled civilian courtship in many ways: gifts, protection from bullies, instruction in military skills, and gradually increasing intimacy. Letters home from new recruits sometimes hint at this process. One young soldier writes to his mother, "I have been fortunate in my tent mate. Gaius is a 10-year veteran who has taken me under his protection. He ensures I get my fair share of rations and has given me a fine cloak for the cold nights. The other recruits envy my good fortune in finding such a protector." The mother, reading this letter, would understand that her son had been claimed by an experienced soldier who would train him, protect him, and, yes, share his bed. This was the unspoken reality of military service that families across the empire had to accept when their sons marched away with the legions. The religious life of military camps also reflected these intimate bonds. Soldiers made dedications to gods not just for victory in battle, but for the safety of specific comrades. Altars have been found dedicated to Mars Victorious, for the safe return of Lucius by Marcus, who loves him. The blending of military religious practice with personal devotion created a spiritual dimension to these relationships. Mystery religions, particularly popular among soldiers, provided additional frameworks for these bonds. The cult of Mithras, with its emphasis on brotherhood, loyalty, and shared sacred meals, attracted military adherents, partly because it sacralized the kinds of relationships that already existed in the camps. Mithraic inscriptions often link pairs of soldiers as co-initiates who underwent the mysteries together. When death came, as it inevitably did in the violent world of Roman military expansion, these bonds shaped how soldiers were remembered. Tombstones erected by surviving tent mates are among the most moving artifacts from the Roman military world. They speak of loss in language that transcends mere comradeship. A tombstone from Germania reads, "To the spirits of the dead, Marcus Aurelius Victor, Optio of the 5th Legion, lived 35 years. Gaius Aurelius Magnus, his heir and tent mate for 8 years, erected this monument to the best of men, whom he will join when fate permits." The imagery on the stone shows 2 soldiers clasping hands, a symbol of their bond that death had interrupted but not broken. Another from Britain. "Here lies Flavius Super, signifer of the 20th Legion, aged 40. His tent mate Cornelius has set up this stone to one who was dearer than a brother." The phrase "dearer than a brother" appears frequently on military tombstones, a coded acknowledgement of relationships that went beyond kinship. The Roman state's attitude toward these military relationships was complex and pragmatic. While civilian law and custom officially condemned sexual relationships between free male citizens, military service existed in a different sphere. Soldiers temporarily surrendered certain citizen rights when they enlisted. They couldn't marry, couldn't engage in business, couldn't vote. In exchange, they entered a world with different rules, where survival depended on bonds that civilian society might condemn. This pragmatism extended to the highest levels of command. Emperors who led military campaigns understood the realities of camp life. Hadrian, himself romantically linked with the youth Antinous, spent years with the armies on the frontiers. His military reforms included improvements to soldier accommodations that made provision for the paired sleeping arrangements that had become standard. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, wrote in his Meditations about the bonds between soldiers he observed during the Marcomannic Wars. "See how they care for each other in the field. each man bound to his tent mate by ties stronger than law or duty. This is nature asserting itself against convention, love finding its way even in the midst of war. The acceptance of these relationships created a unique military culture that differed significantly from civilian Roman society. In the camps, a different set of values prevailed: loyalty to one's mate above family honor, physical courage proven in defense of one's beloved rather than abstract patriotism, a code of honor based on mutual devotion rather than traditional Roman virtues. This military subculture produced its own art, literature, and customs. Soldiers composed poems for each other, carved gemstones with intimate inscriptions, and developed rituals around their relationships. A gem found in Britain shows two soldiers embracing with the inscription "Anima mea," my soul, a term of endearment that suggests the depth of feeling these relationships could inspire. The eventual transformation of the Roman military in the late Empire, the increasing use of barbarian federates, the shift to a more defensive posture, the gradual Christianization of the army, also transformed these intimate patterns. Christian morality, with its condemnation of same-sex relationships, began to conflict with traditional military culture. Yet, even as late as the 4th century, we find evidence of these bonds persisting. A Christian soldier's letter from Egypt struggles with the contradiction. "I pray Christ will forgive the weakness that binds me to Antonius. We have sworn to be baptized together, to find salvation as we have found earthly comfort in each other's company." The decline of the traditional Roman military system meant the decline of these institutionalized intimacies. The barbarian federates who increasingly filled the ranks brought their own cultural practices, including different attitudes toward sexuality and military brotherhood. The 8-man contubernium gave way to different organizational structures that didn't create the same conditions for intimate bonds. Yet the legacy of these relationships echoed through military history. The sacred band of Thebes, explicitly composed of male lovers, had provided one model. But the Roman system was different. Not a special unit of paired lovers, but an entire military culture where such relationships were normalized and integrated into the very structure of military life. When we look at the archaeological remains of Roman military sites, we're seeing the physical traces of emotional and sexual culture that bound the empire together. The paired burial sites, the graffitied love notes in bathhouse walls, the dedication altars to beloved tent mates, all speak to a truth that traditional military history has overlooked. The Roman war machine was powered not just by discipline and training, but by love. These weren't relationships of convenience or mere sexual release. The evidence, literary, archaeological, and epigraphic, points to deep emotional bonds that shaped how soldiers saw themselves in their service. They fought not for abstract concepts of glory, or even for plunder, but for the man beside them in the battle line, the one who shared their tent, their bed, their life. The Roman military deliberately created conditions that fostered these bonds, understanding that soldiers who loved each other would fight more fiercely, endure greater hardships, and maintain the cohesion that made Roman military tactics so effective. It was social engineering on a massive scale, creating a warrior culture where same-sex intimacy wasn't just tolerated, but essential. Modern military historians have often been uncomfortable with this aspect of Roman military life, either ignoring it entirely or treating it as an unfortunate deviation from proper military conduct. But the evidence suggests the opposite. that these intimate bonds were central to Roman military effectiveness, as important as any tactical innovation or technological advance. Consider how different this makes our understanding of Roman expansion. When we read about legions marching into Gaul, Germania, or Britannia, we're not just reading about disciplined military units executing strategic plans. We're reading about thousands of love stories, men bound together by ties that gave them the courage to march into unknown lands and face terrible odds. The Roman genius wasn't just in creating a professional military or in developing superior tactics. It was in understanding human nature well enough to harness the power of intimate bonds in the service of imperial expansion. They created a system where love and war weren't opposites, but complementary forces, where the same passion that drove men into each other's arms also drove them to victory on the battlefield. This system also explains some of the legendary loyalty of Roman troops to successful commanders. Generals who understood and respected the intimate culture of the camps earned devotion that went beyond mere military hierarchy. Julius Caesar, known for his rapport with common soldiers, allegedly knew the names not just of his centurions but of their tent mates. This personal touch, recognizing the relationships that mattered most to his men, created bonds of loyalty that helped him conquer Gaul and ultimately Rome itself. Conversely, commanders who disrupted these relationships faced serious morale problems. Attempts to impose civilian moral standards on military camps invariably failed. When the Emperor Domitian tried to enforce stricter moral codes in the legions, including restrictions on relationships between soldiers, he faced near mutiny from the frontier armies. The soldiers understood what perhaps Domitian didn't, that their survival depended on the bonds he was trying to break. The Roman military camp was thus a space of remarkable freedom within a highly structured society. While Roman civilians faced strict moral codes and legal restrictions, soldiers existed in a parallel world where different rules applied. This wasn't libertinism or mere sexual license. It was a carefully constructed alternative social system designed to create the most effective fighting force in the ancient world. The medical corps played a crucial role in maintaining this system. Military doctors didn't just treat wounds and diseases. They managed the health of these relationships. Medical texts from military contexts include advice on preventing sexually transmitted infections, treating injuries related to sexual activity, and managing the emotional fallout of relationship conflicts. The pragmatic, non-judgmental tone of these texts suggests an institutional acceptance of soldiers' intimate lives. One medical manual advises, when treating injuries sustained in passion between tent mates, the medicus must remember that harmony in the contubernum is essential to military effectiveness. Heal the body, but also counsel reconciliation when possible. This holistic approach to soldier welfare recognized that physical and emotional health were inseparable in the close quarters of military life. The Roman military also developed mechanisms for dealing with the end of these relationships. When soldiers completed their service, they faced the challenge of reintegrating into civilian society, where the relationships that had sustained them for decades were suddenly illegal or socially unacceptable. Some veterans solved this by settling together in colonial settlements, maintaining their partnerships under the guise of business arrangements or shared households. Veteran colonies often showed settlement patterns suggesting paired veterans continuing to live together. Archaeological surveys of places like Colchester in Britain or Timgad in North Africa reveal houses that seem designed for two adult males living as a domestic unit, rather than traditional family structures. These veterans had spent their adult lives in intimate partnership. Civilian marriage held little appeal compared to continuing bonds forged in military service. The psychological impact of these relationships on Roman military culture was profound. Soldiers developed identities that centered on their military partnerships rather than their origins or family connections. A man might enter the legions as Lucius from Tuscany, son of Marcus, but after 25 years his primary identity was as Gaius's tent mate, defined by the relationship that had shaped his adult life. This transformation of identity helps explain the remarkable cohesion of Roman military units. These weren't just soldiers serving together. They were interconnected networks of intimate relationships, each man bound to others by ties of love, loyalty, and shared experience. Breaking one link in this chain, through death, desertion, or reassignment, sent ripples through the entire unit. The Roman military funeral provides a final window into these relationships. When a soldier died, his tent mate typically took charge of funeral arrangements, acting as chief mourner and heir. Military funeral clubs ensured that every soldier would receive proper rites, but the emotional center of these ceremonies was the surviving partner's grief. Funeral orations, some preserved in inscriptions, speak of loss in deeply personal terms. Here I bury not just my tent mate, but half my soul. 20 years we served together, sharing every hardship, every triumph. Now I count the days until I can join him in the afterlife, where no enemy can part us again. These weren't just words for public consumption. The suicide rate among soldiers who lost long-term tent mates was significant enough to concern military authorities. Some men simply couldn't conceive of continuing service without their partner. Others completed their service but never successfully readjusted to life without the one who had defined their existence for so long. The Roman military system thus created a paradox, an institution dedicated to violence and conquest that was held together by bonds of love. The same soldiers who showed legendary brutality toward enemies could display extraordinary tenderness toward their tent mates. The compartmentalization required, killing by day, loving by night, shaped a unique warrior psychology. This psychological complexity appears in the few personal accounts that survive from Roman soldiers. A letter from a soldier in Judea describes the mental strain. Yesterday, we destroyed a rebel village, showing no mercy as ordered. Last night, Quintus held me as I wept, understanding without words why I needed his comfort. How can the same hands that deal death also give such gentle caresses? Yet, without his touch, I think I would go mad from what we do. The intimate bonds between soldiers also influenced Roman military tactics. The legendary discipline of Roman formations, their ability to maintain cohesion under extreme pressure, wasn't just the result of training. Men fought differently when their beloved stood beside them. They held formations that logic said should break, because breaking would mean abandoning their partner. The testudo, tortoise formation, where soldiers created interlocking shields above and around their unit, required absolute trust between men. You had to know that the soldier whose shield protected your head wouldn't falter, wouldn't lower his guard even as missiles rained down. This trust came not from training alone, but from the intimate knowledge of your shield partner developed over years of shared life. Battle accounts that emphasize Roman discipline and tactical superiority miss this emotional component. When Roman lines held against overwhelming odds, it wasn't just superior equipment or training that made the difference. it was men choosing death over dishonoring themselves in their lovers' eyes, choosing to die together rather than live apart. The Roman military investment in fostering these bonds paid dividends that went beyond battlefield effectiveness. Soldiers bound by love were less likely to desert, less likely to mutiny, more likely to re-enlist. They policed each other's behavior, not wanting to bring shame on their partner. They maintained equipment and fitness standards because their partner's life might depend on it. This created a self-reinforcing system where military effectiveness and intimate bonds strengthened each other. Success in battle reinforced partnerships. Men who had saved each other's lives were bound even more closely. Shared hardship during campaigns deepened emotional connections. The cycle of danger and deliverance, fear and comfort, created relationships of extraordinary intensity. The Roman military calendar reflected the importance of these bonds. Festival days weren't just for honoring gods or emperors. They were opportunities for soldiers to celebrate their partnerships. The Saturnalia, with its temporary inversion of social rules, was particularly significant in military camps. Soldiers could openly display affection that might be more circumspect at other times. Gift-giving between tent mates marked these festivals. Surviving artifacts include items clearly intended as intimate gifts, engraved rings, decorated weapons, personal grooming items inscribed with terms of endearment. These objects, now in museums, once carried deep personal meaning, tokens of affection between men who faced death together. The Roman military's creation of alternative family structures also extended to inheritance and memorial practices. Soldiers routinely named tent mates as heirs, ensuring their partners would be provided for. Military wills, preserved on papyrus and bronze tablets, show men leaving everything to their tent mates with phrases like, "Who has been more than brother to me?" or "My faithful companion in all things." These inheritance patterns created legal precedents that civilian law wouldn't recognize for same-sex partners. In military contexts, the validity of these relationships for legal purposes was unquestioned. A tent mate could inherit, could make funeral arrangements, could receive death benefits, rights that in civilian contexts belonged only to blood family or legally recognized spouses. As the Roman Empire evolved, so did the nature of military intimacies. The shift from offensive campaigns to frontier defense meant soldiers spent more time in permanent camps. Relationships that might have lasted only for a campaign season became lifetime partnerships. Archaeological evidence from frontier forts shows modifications to standard military architecture. Quarters redesigned to accommodate long-term couples rather than temporary pairings. The Christianization of the empire in the 4th century created new tensions around military intimacies. Christian morality condemned same-sex relationships, but the practical realities of military life remained unchanged. Christian soldiers found themselves caught between religious doctrine and military culture, leading to complex negotiations of identity and practice. Some Christian soldiers reframed their relationships in spiritual terms. They were brothers in Christ, whose physical intimacy was secondary to their spiritual bond. Others compartmentalized, maintaining traditional military relationships while seeking forgiveness for what they saw as necessary sins. Still, others left military service rather than compromise their faith or their partnerships. The gradual barbarization of the Roman military also changed intimate practices. Germanic and other tribal warriors brought different traditions of male bonding, some similar to Roman practices, others quite different. the mixing of military cultures created new hybrid forms of intimacy, documented in the changing burial practices and material culture of late Roman military sites. By the 5th century, the classical Roman military system had largely disappeared, and with it, the institutionalized intimacies that had characterized legion life for centuries. But the model it provided, of a military force bound together by love as much as discipline, influenced military thinking long after Rome fell. Medieval military orders, Renaissance mercenary companies, and even modern military forces have grappled with the same human realities that Rome addressed through the contubernium system. Men in extreme circumstances form intense bonds. Military effectiveness can be enhanced by channeling rather than suppressing these bonds, and the warrior's life creates its own moral universe that doesn't always align with civilian values. Today, as modern militaries debate the place of LGBTQ+ soldiers in their ranks, the Roman example provides historical perspective. The most effective military force in ancient history not only tolerated same-sex relationships between soldiers, but actively fostered them as a source of unit cohesion and battlefield effectiveness. The legions conquered the known world not in spite of these intimate bonds, but because of them. When we visit museums and see Roman military artifacts, the helmets, swords, and shields that evoke the might of the legions, we're seeing only the surface. Behind each piece of equipment was a soldier, and behind most soldiers was a tent mate who helped him strap on that armor, who stood beside him in battle, who shared his bed and his life. The true strength of Rome lay not in bronze and iron, but in the bonds between men who loved each other enough to die side by side. The ruins of Roman military camps across Europe, Africa, and Asia preserve the physical traces of these relationships. In the foundations of barracks, the remains of bathhouses, the hastily scratched graffiti on walls, we can still read the story of men who found love in the most unlikely circumstances. Their voices, preserved in stone and papyrus, speak across the centuries of bonds that transcended the violence of their profession. As our imagined Marcus and Gaius prepared for battle on that cold morning by the Danube, they were participating in a tradition that stretched back centuries and would echo forward long after Rome fell. They were part of a system that understood a fundamental truth, that men fight hardest for what they love most. In making tent mates into lovers, the Roman military created warriors who would hold any line, storm any wall, endure any hardship, as long as their beloved fought beside them. The hidden intimacies of Rome's legions weren't a footnote to military history. They were central to Roman military success. They remind us that human beings are capable of finding love even in the harshest circumstances, that institutional structures can channel human needs in ways that serve larger purposes, and that the stories we tell about the past are often sanitized versions that miss the messy, complicated, beautiful reality of human experience. In the end, the Roman military's greatest innovation wasn't the gladius or the pilum, the testudo or the cohort system. It was the recognition that love between soldiers could be the strongest weapon in their arsenal. By creating space for these bonds to flourish, by building them into the very structure of military life, Rome forged an army bound by ties stronger than iron, an army of lovers who conquered the world not for glory or gold, but for each other. The legacy of these hidden intimacies lives on in every military force that recognizes the importance of unit cohesion, in every warrior who fights harder because someone they care about stands beside them, in every act of battlefield courage inspired by love rather than hate. The Roman legions may be dust, but the human truths they embodied, that love and war are not opposites but intertwined aspects of the human experience, remain as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago on the frontiers of empire. Marcus and Gaius, our imagined soldiers, did face the Germanic tribes the next morning. Historical records tell us that Legio II Adiutrix, fighting along the Danube in 168 AD, held their section of the line against overwhelming odds. Archaeology tells us more. Paired burials from this battle, men found with arms around each other, positioned to suggest they died protecting one another rather than fleeing. They kept their promise, in this life and the next, side by side as they had sworn. Their story, multiplied by thousands across the centuries of Roman military dominance, reveals the true secret of the legions. Rome conquered through love. The love between soldiers who would rather die together than live apart. In understanding this, we understand not just Roman military history, but something fundamental about the human capacity to find meaning, purpose, and connection even in the midst of humanity's darkest endeavor: war. The tourists who walk through the ruins of Roman military sites, the students who study Roman tactical innovations, the historians who chronicle the rise and fall of empires, all glimpse only part of the story. The full truth lies in those paired burials, those scratched graffiti declaring eternal love, those dedication stones where soldiers honored their tent mates above all others. It lies in recognizing that the Roman military genius lay not in suppressing human nature, but in channeling it. Not in creating automatons, but in fostering warriors whose greatest strength came from their deepest vulnerability, their capacity to love. This is the hidden history of Rome's legions, an empire built on the bodies of men who loved each other, sustained by bonds that military necessity transformed into military advantage, and ultimately brought down when those bonds could no longer hold against the forces of change. It's a history of power and tenderness, violence and intimacy, discipline and passion, a history that challenges our assumptions about sexuality, warfare, and the nature of empire itself. In the end, when Rome fell, it wasn't just a political system that collapsed. It was an entire way of life, including the unique culture of military intimacy that had sustained the legions for centuries. The barbarians who inherited the empire brought different values, different structures, different ways of organizing military life. The age of the contubernium, the tent group bound by love as much as duty, passed into history, leaving only traces for those willing to look beyond conventional narratives. But those traces tell a story worth recovering. They speak of human resilience, of love flourishing in the most unlikely places, of institutions that succeeded by working with rather than against human nature. They remind us that history is always more complex than its simplified retellings, that the past contains models of human organization we might never imagine if we didn't have evidence they existed. The hidden intimacies of Rome's legions offer no simple lessons for the present. We cannot and should not romanticize a system built on conquest, slavery, and violence. But we can recognize the humanity of those who lived within that system, who found ways to create meaning and connection despite its brutalities. We can honor the men who loved each other across the centuries, whose bonds helped build an empire, but whose stories transcended imperial ambitions. As the sun sets over the ruins of a Roman fort on some distant frontier, as shadows lengthen across stones that once echoed with the voices of soldiers preparing for battle or celebrating survival, we might imagine we can still hear them, the whispered endearments, the promises exchanged, the declarations of love that gave meaning to lives bounded by discipline and duty. These are the voices history forgot, but archaeology remembers. These are the loves that conquered the world, one tent group at a time, one paired burial at a time, one scratched graffito declaring eternal devotion at a time. The hidden intimacies of Rome's legions remind us that human beings will always find ways to love, even in the midst of war. That institutional structures can channel but never fully control human emotions. That the stories we tell about the past are always partial, always edited, always missing the messy complexity of lived experience. In recovering these hidden stories, we recover not just historical facts, but human truths. Truths about love, war, and the endless capacity of human beings to find light in the darkness, connection in isolation, and meaning in the most unlikely circumstances. The empire has fallen. The legions are dust. But love endures. In the archaeological record, in the surviving texts, in the patterns of settlement and burial that speak of bonds that outlasted bronze and stone. This is the true legacy of Rome's military might. Not just that they conquered, but how they conquered, bound together by ties that no enemy could break, because they were forged not just in the fires of battle, but in the gentler flames of human affection. In this life and the next, the soldiers promised each other. And, in a way, they kept that promise. Their stories live on, hidden but not lost, waiting to remind us that history is always human history, that every institution is made of individuals with their own needs and desires, and that love has always been one of humanity's most powerful forces, on the battlefield and beyond.